Indeed, around the 10th century, our main idea is called 软体自由 or software liberty, meaning that people impacted by software should have the ultimate say in how to deploy such software. It's a very simple idea, but at the time, it was a struggle to get it accepted by the major governments in the world, let alone the Silicon Valley companies. We do have many allies at a point in Taiwan. Previously in this channel, we mentioned the National Academy in Taiwan, universities, and so on, that focus on this simple idea of letting the people who enjoy broadband as a human right to prototype simple systems that fit their neighborhoods use cases, their districts use cases, and so on. And that is broadly called civic technology. And so my ministry is basically offering all sorts of ways to look at the cutting edge ideas that emerge from those civic technologies that solve the problem for specific neighborhoods, and then just to endorse it to ensure that we can scale it to national or even international level, and then takes what works on a smaller scale and work on a larger scale.
Hi, welcome back to Innovative Minds. I'm your host, T+. In this episode, we will discuss the limits of freedom of expression, especially regarding misinformation and other potential threats to open societies. Jillian, during your time at Electronic Frontier Foundation, have you noticed any pattern in how democracies and authoritarian states conduct content moderation?
Ooh, that's such a big question. Let me think for a moment. I think that, governments are often going to act together. One really great example of this where my opinion is all over the place on it. I'm quite torn in how we look at it is online extremism. So a few years ago, there was this horrific attack on a mosque in New Zealand that resulted in the creation of the Christchurch Call. Oh no, I always forget the full title of it, but the Christchurch Call is basically aimed at removing or moderating online extremism, violence, terrorism, etc. And this was put out by the governments of New Zealand and France initially. I was one of just a few civil society members who were brought in to the initial launch of the process. And we were not brought into the creation of the Christchurch Call, but rather brought in to kind of comment on the launch and to be part of that. And so there was some civil society inclusion, but I would say that over the years, this process has become somewhat problematic. The government of Jordan, for example, has been brought into this. Of course, this is a government that does work to limit terrorism and works with a lot of countries in the region. But at the same time, this is also a government with a history of censorship, and one that is currently in the process of putting out a new cybercrime law, which would be very dangerous for free expression in that country. And so we can see the ways in which democracies, strong democracies like New Zealand, democracies like France, which don't really have a great track record of late when it comes to online free speech. And then, of course, Jordan, which is, an authoritarian country by most measures, work together to limit expression. And so I would say that in this example, all of these countries have a similar interest, which is, certainly one with noble goals, but the process by which they've limited speech has included things like putting violent and extremist imagery into a shared database that companies use to limit expression. And that database has no outside oversight. So we don't know what's being put in it, how that content is being determined to be violent or terrorist in nature, and even what definitions are being used to define terrorism, which is, obviously a rather problematic thing as well. And so just to get out of that example and kind of wrap up on this, I would say that, the methods that governments undertake are different, but the results are often the same.
That's something to keep an eye on. Another commonly used argument for limiting free dissemination of information is the risk of disinformation. In your opinion, what is the best approach to tackling this problem without compromising freedom of expression?
Sure. So we do draw the distinction, as EU does nowadays, between domestic misinformation, people are misinformed, and foreign information manipulation and interference, or FIMI. And the difference is quite easily understood, especially leading up to an election, which we are currently in, because there are a lot of kind of campaign movements where people from one particular campaign just accuse the people from the other campaign for not doing this, for doing this too much, and so on. And some of them were misinformed, the numbers were wrong or things like that. But they always have a platform, something they're for, something they're against. On the other hand, the FEMI almost always just focus on increasing polarization. They invested in the extreme versions of both sides of a debate, and they don't stand for anything. They're just against democratic institutions. And so the FEMI part, I think, is quite similar to what we have already observed in the attacks in the cybersecurity area, in that it's now almost always automated. It is created by synthetic media. They don't care about actually engaging in community conversations. There's no context upon which that they speak, and the expression is almost always automated to just divide people. And so for these, we're basically treating it as cybersecurity attacks. We shared the threat indications of the actors, of the behavior. We don't actually focus on the content. The content almost doesn't matter in this regard, because they're going to morph a lot, right? A phishing attack, something that convinces you to wire some money to a random bank somewhere, can be personalized in all sorts of different ways, but we wouldn't say that this is an expression of the spam or scam bot. It doesn't make sense in this case. What we're looking for is the single account, just emailing or posting messages to hundreds of thousands of people, each slightly different, but with the flows of information and of cryptocurrency flowing a particular way. And so we counter them very easily by the existing cybersecurity toolkit. On the other hand, anything that is part of the domestic conversation, we just provide the tools for the social sector journalists, for the fact checkers, for the people who post the most viral misinformation of the day and interview experts and put on those notices, and also work with the educators and so on to get the students also in the mood of becoming fact-checking. We have found that it's not the checked facts that inoculates the people. It is the act of going through fact-checking, of thinking like a journalist, that inoculates a young mind or a lifelong learning mind. And so that has always been our goal, is just to use those local misinformation as a kind of mRNA that you can make a vaccine or a cure around which the spike proteins and so on are contributed by the civil society, instead of just putting everybody in quarantine. And so we must make a distinction between the foreign FEMI and the domestic misinformation.
I love that analogy.
What about you, Jillian? What's Electronic Frontier Foundation's stance on this issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's somewhat similar to Audrey's. I mean, so trying to capture the EFF perspective and also my own here, I mean, I would say that, I really agree with what Audrey just said, that it's often the actors and the methods that matter a lot more than the speech itself. I mean, of course, we have to look at what's being said. But I think that, one of the key things here is that when you or I or any average citizen, although, maybe you're not so average in your role, but when any average citizen shares something that's misinformation, they're often not doing so from a malicious perspective. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Also have to consider the impact of what it means when, my aunt or uncle shares something on Facebook that, let's say, misinformation about vaccines. Why are they doing that? Is it because they've also been duped, and by whom? And so it's those large actors, the bad actors, the ones who are intentionally misleading people, that we should be focused on. And so, when I look at, there was a great article and ensuing campaign a couple of years ago about the top actors sharing vaccine misinformation. Now, I'm really interested in the issues around health and medical misinformation, because I think that there are really two sides of this story. Strong believer in vaccines, I should say that to start out. But when we're looking at this, we're looking at these intentional bad actors, this group of them that have been spreading this information for what? For profit. And that's something that we need to consider. So the methods that they're using, the ways in which they're trying to cause harm, create discord, for me, that is, that crosses a line where there's really no value in their ability to express this. At the same time, I think it's also important for me, I'm a cancer survivor. It's important for me to emphasize that I think some of the ways in which policymakers and platforms specifically have gone after medical misinformation, disseminated by average people, has been problematic. Shutting down groups where people talk about even completely bogus cures or methods of curing can have the effect of also shutting down speech where people are trying to find out or understand their diagnosis. The internet and internet groups, cancer groups, were incredibly important for me, both figuring out my diagnosis and understanding what my possibilities for treatment were, because I wasn't always able to access that information from doctors. And so we have to ensure that people have places to speak about things, to question things, even if that questioning can sometimes be problematic or even potentially cause harm to other citizens.
One possible solution to preserve freedom of expression while preventing the spread of false information is redesigning social media. Some suggest implementing a mechanism that requires users to copy and paste content before sharing it, instead of instantaneously sharing it with their audience. It is an unbiased policy that could help prevent the spread of false information. Jillian, what are your thoughts on this potential solution?
Sure. I think we've seen measures like this come about in other contexts. I remember one in I want to say India a few years back, where during a certain crisis, people were limited to send only a certain number of text messages or SMS per day. That one is obviously a lot more restrictive, but I think that in this case, the idea of having to copy paste something into somewhere new and then, maybe modify it, share it differently, I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing. I think, again, it's all in the implementation and how this is, how and when this is undertaken. So I think like when we look at the ways that, to use one example, family WhatsApp groups or these big chats that have hundreds of people in them. Those are areas where misinformation and disinformation can spread really rapidly. And so ensuring that people aren't simply mindlessly copying and pasting things isn't necessarily bad. Again, I think we've also seen this on social media platforms, maybe previous Twitter before Elon Musk, where you were prompted to read an article before sharing it. Now, I almost rarely would actually open the article and read it myself, honestly, because I usually know what I'm sharing before doing so. But that prompt did sometimes make me stop and think. And I think that for people, who are not as well versed or not as well researched in the topic that they're talking about, I think that this can potentially be a good thing. Audrey, I'm curious to hear if you agree.
Yeah. So the language model-based notice bots that I was just alluding to serves as something like that in large family groups. It's basically a bot that you can add to your family group, and that adds community notes, another Twitter-like innovation, into that chat group. So the idea is that anyone who shares something that has been collected by community notes, like curation services, you don't get censorship at any kind, but if you just mindlessly copy that and it has already been clarified before, immediately that bot adds the relevant context with an invitation that you can also participate as a community note member to the Cofacts collective. And I think this kind of bridges across closed end-to-end encrypted groups is the kind of technology for plurality that we're looking for, because if it is infringing on the end-to-end encryption in the smaller groups, no amount of flood control actually can stop those very weird ideas from developing in such end-to-end encrypted groups. On the other hand, if there are no bridges, or if the bridges are only built by top-down state measures, then we lose the diversity of perspectives that is always important to get the context restored. So for each and every, you mentioned vaccine or medical or whatever contested topic, the community notes, again invented by the old Twitter, not x.com, they basically prioritizes the notes that were upvoted by volunteers by both sides of the ideological spectrum. So anything that adds value as a context to people of both sides of the spectrum is of value to distribute it more widely than any other message. Basically, it gets a favorite platforming, right? The guaranteed reach, basically. But if the both sides of the spectrum do not have this kind of bridging mechanism, they tend to just be in their own end-to-end encrypted groups, and there's no way for them to discover that there are actually shared community nodes that they can act in a contextualized way, right? So I think the social sector plays a unique part in this endeavor, because as state, we cannot say, let's moderate what journalists consider as headlines. That would be a gross overstep and misstep by the state. On the other hand, no single media can say, oh, let's provide a notice and context for every other message, and then they become the de facto ministry of truth, right? So on the other hand, social sector is something that is running on open source, running on multi-stakeholder internet governance models, rough consensus model, and ones that you can actually fork. It's been forked like 5 different times by different groups. They can then add their own community nodes, algorithms, and context, and so on, and then invite them into the end-to-end encrypted message groups. So I do think that flood control have some merit, but anything that adds context has even more merit than anything that is simply based on behavioral nudges.
Yeah, no, I really agree with you. And I mean, I think that it almost makes me think of like, encouraging a slow messaging movement, encouraging us to slow down and really think about what we're saying. Because that's one of the biggest societal changes I've seen from social media is just how quickly everyone's moving, how quickly the news moves, and our commentary as well.
Right, yeah. And we talked with Justin Rosenstein previously on this podcast, that the person who co-invented the like button, right? And he talks about how intentional one must be in every step of interface design to make sure that people are in a more mindful state when engaging with each other's contexts and messages and expression. I think I like expression much better than content in this regard, because expression then is a cultural invitation, and content is something you just quickly consume, right? So I think in this particular sense, I think expression fits much better than content or merely speech.
I love that. And I love the idea around mindfulness as well. It's something I think about all the time when I'm working quickly and what am I missing?
Thank you both for your insights. Now, let's move on to how different parts of the world are responding to the issues we just mentioned. Among the regulations in force, the European Union Digital Services Act has been receiving significant attention. Jillian, what does the EFF think of this regulation?
I mean, I would say that with any legislation, our views on this are mixed. I'll start by saying the positives, and then I can focus a little bit on the areas in which we disagree. So I think, the DSA does some really good things. It retains principles under previous internet rules that help make the internet free, allowing liability exemptions, for example, for online platforms for the speech of others, limiting the monitoring of users, ensuring, no things like point blank upload filters. And it also improves things, in ways like bringing transparency, higher standards of transparency around content moderation, and giving users more control around algorithmically curated recommendations. So these are all, examples of really good things. And there's other stuff as well. But let me kind of get into the ways in which the DSA is problematic. So first of all, I think, I talked about the DSA Human Rights Alliance earlier, bringing in people from across the world to be able to provide input into this. This has really been an uphill battle because the EU is going to do what's best for EU citizens, which is, again, it's a lot of different countries. So that's not always something that's agreed upon or a blanket good for everyone in the EU. We have to remember that there are countries in the EU that are moving towards authoritarianism, such as Hungary, countries like Poland, which are trying to restrict LGBTQIA rights. So these are areas of concern, of course, and areas where I don't necessarily trust the implementation of some of the more restrictive things. It also, the DSA gives too much power to government agencies to flag and remove potentially illegal content. Again, illegal is not always the same definition across the EU, and to uncover data about anonymous speakers. And then there's just a lot of ambiguity around some of the ways in which the DSA obligates platforms to assess and mitigate systemic risks. So we're starting to see this come into fruition, come into practice around some of the first assessments. And I think it really remains to be seen how some of this implementation is going to play out and some of the impacts that the DSA will have.
Audrey, has Taiwan been paying attention to the EU's Digital Services Act?
Yeah, the Taiwanese society have had a very large societal conversation around DSA in the form of the Digital Intermediaries Act draft put forward by the National Communications Commission in 2022. And I think the societal consensus, the rough consensus, was that the transparency, the liability, all these parts are good, but they must be implemented in such a way that does not increase the governmental step, the governmental reach. And this is important because, as I mentioned, people over 40 here in Taiwan still remember the martial law, and they do see that when the state has too much reach when it comes to what is legal and illegal expression, and the definition, as you mentioned, can be a little bit fuzzy, it does create chilling effects down the line. And since we are proudly, out of martial law and is, according to Freedom House and many other organizations, either the first place or the second place after Japan in terms of freedom and democracy in Asia, we don't want to go back to those authoritarian directions, falling to the 10th place or 20th place in Asia. That's not acceptable by any of the Taiwanese citizens. And so we switched to a idea of just identifying the overt harms, like scamming, using deep fakes to synthesize, to scam people, the unconsensual intimate images, deep fake pornography, meddling with elections, foreign interference in terms of harmful services and products, and so on. And in different laws and different amendments, added more liability and more accountability requirements for the internet platforms. But there is no one single act as we speak. And for this year, the NCC already said that they now prefer for this year to focus on the specific harms in specific acts instead of having this overarching act that puts the state's ability on all illegal content. We basically just act on the kind of illegal content that are clearly harmful, and the societal rough consensus is easily gathered around.
That's so great to hear. I mean, I think one of the things that I'm really interested in is how regulations, how legislation being put forth in the EU impacts other countries. And it's really good to hear that, that Taiwan has had this civil society conversation, this citizen conversation around it. I mean, I think one of the things that really concerns me at the moment is seeing what's coming out of France, this idea by EU Internal Commissioner Thierry Breton to try to use the DSA to implement internet shutdowns at a time where there are riots or protests, demonstrations in France, and just the lack of consideration for how implementing internet shutdowns in a purported democracy will impact other places or influence other places. And so, of course, internet shutdowns being a massive harm throughout a number of places, but in particularly on the African continent. And so, I think that this is something where I get really worried about the lack of consideration for the rest of the world that the EU has. And it often feels very, we're up here and we're not paying attention to everything that's happening elsewhere in the majority world. But these regulations do have a really strong impact on other countries. And often, we've seen this in the way that the Network Enforcement Act from Germany was copycatted in so many different places and often to great harm. So I'm really glad to hear that Taiwan has looked at this and said, we're going to do our own thing.
Yeah, indeed. We had that conversation in 2018, actually, when SDG was being copied by many nearby jurisdictions, and even faster than DSA. I think the civil societies collectively very quickly said we don't want anything like that. And I think that's great, because having something that is there for people to deliberate around is much better than just a kind of unspeakable fear against some looming threat that people can't quite put a finger on. So I'm thankful that there are DSAs and SDGs of the world, because these are social objects, but people can deliberate around. And I'm also thankful that in Taiwan there are many very active civil society organizations that connects very well internationally, so that we can be part of the majority world's deliberation and also share what we have discussed here.
That's fantastic.
Audrey, I want to pick up on something you mentioned earlier. Can you explain to our audience what rough consensus is?
Yes. It is a very early, I would say, ethos, right? It's a mantra by the early internet pioneers. And the entire quote goes like, and I quote, "We reject kings, presidents, and voting. We believe in rough consensus and running code." And so this is a very different way to think about policy making. It's what we call in software development continuous integration. So instead of 51% of people winning for 4 years and the other 51% winning another 4 years, we have instead a daily conversation. So on the internet, pretty much any code can be changed. And if two people around the world connected by the internet change their code in tandem, then they can speak in a very different way from everybody else. It's called end-to-end innovation. And because of that, we don't have to wait for a very fine, strong consensus for the entire internet to upgrade. People who want to upgrade to a more secure communication can do so before the rest of the internet catches up. And so because of that, people who prioritize innovation have to work with what we call stakeholder groups, people who are impacted, harmed potentially by those innovations. And they form what we call stakeholder groups because each group holds a stake in what will be caused by this new end-to-end innovation. And so the internet has this culture that as long as people roughly agree that this is a good thing, we don't make a lot of effort to agree on the specific details the way lawmakers do, but rather just go and implement those shared ideas. And when one idea have 5, 10 very different implementations, people gather around again and see what is the good common practice, and then we can turn it into another request for comment or RFC. So think of it as a legislative process that anyone with an email address can join, and anyone can win a little bit every day, but there is no winner-take-all scenario.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I love that. I think that that's such a great definition of it. I was thinking, what am I going to say to this? Because it's not something that I have the same kind of or the same level of expertise as Audrey. But the way you've explained it makes perfect sense. And from my perspective, I mean, I can just sort of talk a little bit about how I bring this into my work as well, or in the FF's work. One of the things we've thought about a lot over the years and that I've worked on is, taking this and iterating it to make sure that other voices outside of certain countries are included in it. And so, rough consensus for a long time in the early internet mode was really sort of limited to people who had certain knowledge and certain skill sets. And as the internet's evolved, I think it's been really important to make sure that people who are not traditionally technologists or coders or free speech experts are involved in this. So when it comes to, content moderation rules and practices, I mean, one of the things that I've been really engaged in with a large number of other people, of course, as you can see through things like the Santa Clara Principles, is bringing together a bunch of global stakeholders around how content moderation works. So for a few years now, I've run a mailing list, co-run a mailing list where we also have monthly calls that bring together people who are, experts on EU and US legislation with people who are, say, experts on, for example, Ugandan legislation or activism. I think we've got people from 100+ countries now who speak, of course, probably 100+ languages as well, but who are talking together about these things. And it's really interesting to watch in these conversations someone from the US react to the way that someone from Uganda, for example, is working, or vice versa, and what they're doing to engage in these processes and what their views on legislation and policies look like. And so it's from things like this project that have come out, things like the Santa Clara Principles, or some of the conversations that are being had at conferences like RightsCon, which is put on by a group called Access Now, which we were talking about before this started. And so this is something that, I really hope to see continue, and even continue in ways like through the DSA Human Rights Alliance, to make sure that our governments and our legislators are listening to these global communities of rough consensus as well.
Yeah, this is partly why the Internet governance forums are called forums, right? Instead of a parliamentary body, right, or a oversight board, or things like that, which presumes that we already know the members, that it is a closed multi-stakeholder group in the sense that it has pre-assigned seats for various different representatives and so on. Instead, on the kind of open multi-stakeholder forums, the ones that Jillian just mentioned, anyone who can show that they have a stake, that they're harmed somehow, or they can contribute somehow, naturally gets a seat at a table. And I think this culture, this internet governance culture, is something that is very worth preserving. I'm a conservative in this regard, in that I want to conserve this part of the very early internet culture instead of being diluted by multinational corporations or a multilateral insisting on country-representative way of working. And I think we have conserved that culture pretty well in the IGF communities, and it also has good contributors from, for example, around climate, around net zero. It is now well accepted that people are suffering from climate injustice, must have a seat at the table regardless of what their company or what their country thinks. And so for many other global collaborations, many now point to the internet governance and rough consensus as a good precedent to organize their own ways of forums and grassroots organization.
The Internet's conception of governance and the concept of rough consensus would undoubtedly play a major role in the future. Before we end this conversation, do you have any questions for each other?
Oh no, I'm so put on the spot. I have so many questions for Audrey. Can I ask what you thought of the book? I'm really curious to hear just your perspective on it, and on what you think I guess where you think the solutions proposed, or even just the I don't know how to ask. Here, I'll start that one more time because that was rambling. Audrey, I'm really curious to hear what you think of my book, and what you think we should be doing going forward when it comes to content moderation.
Yeah, so I'm so inspired around the ideas that I read from your book, that around that time that I decided to start writing a book. So in the 7 years since I joined the cabinet, I've never found time to write a book. And many people interviewed me and published many books, but these are basically because I relinquished copyright of my interview transcripts. So people can actually easily take my transcripts and make books that says these are Audrey Tang's words, but I didn't actually compose that book. But I think the way that you compose those ideas and narrating your own stories and weaving it and including, because I was reading the ebook edition, right, your reflections after the pandemic and the insurrections and so on, I think this is a perfect blend of the personal storytelling, almost like a blog, and also the connection to the world's policy zeitgeist, if you will. So I think highly of the book, and as I already mentioned, that it plays an important part in shaping our own DSA conversations in the communities, in the circles that I frequent in Taiwan. So well done. And if you're physically here, I'd ask for a author's signature, but maybe we can do a PGP signature or something after.
Well, hopefully we'll get to meet soon in person, and I really appreciate that. And I'm glad that you mentioned blogging, because that's a community that I come from and that is very near and dear to my heart, as I know it is yours as well.
So blog, interestingly, is translated differently in different Mandarin-speaking groups. In Taiwan, we were the first ones to translate and adopt the early blogging tools like movable types and things like that. And we translated in a 部落格, which is literally the connection, like bookshelves, shelves of different tribes, of different kinships, right? So this is a very different translation than other Mandarin translations. This is basically looking at blog not just as content, as web logs, but really as expressions and the forms of kinship that we can form online. And I think this kind of we blog and putting an emphasis on we is always part of my culture and the kind of culture that we're trying to spread as part of Taiwan's Ministry of Digital Affairs call to free the future, basically leaving more potentials and leaving more possible futures for the future generations by sharing, not restricting their ways of expression.
That's so beautiful. I love that.
Ensuring freedom of expression for future generations is indeed the key to a harmonious future. Thanks again to Jillian and Audrey for joining us today. And if you like this episode, be sure to subscribe, share, and let us know what you think. See you next time on Innovative Minds.
Hi, I'm Jillian York, EFF's Director for International Freedom of Expression. See you on TaiwanPlus.
Hello, I'm Audrey Tang, Taiwan's Digital Minister. See you on TaiwanPlus.